Hi, this is Jason Malott. I'm author of Adam is God, Eve is Us, Strange Stories about Aliens, Angels, and the Love of God from the book of Genesis. And I'm coming back to talk to you once again about a chapter in my book. We are actually in chapter 6, and this is Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. Now, I hope you recognize the reference. If you have spent any time in church, you would know this one. One of those really annoying songs that people sing, and it goes on and on and on and on. But anyways, the point of the chapter is I wanted to talk about something very strange in the book of Genesis, and one of these things is one of these things that a lot of people get hung up on, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. It's the story of Isaac and Abraham, but Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, as God asked him to do this. And I always thought this was kind of a weird story. It really didn't make sense until I really dove into it and learned what I could about it. So first of all, I did want to point out in my chapter, I do quote the Knights of Ni from the Holy Grail. We demand a sacrifice. There's something to think about. When you talk about back in the ancient days, people would sacrifice things because they knew that they had to do something to be able to get the attention of these powers up above, these gods, these things. And so they would sacrifice, maybe some grain, some wheat, some animals. And once they've done all of that, if they still can't get what they're looking for, whether it be having a child or that it rains, something as easy as that, or their crops growing or their animals staying healthy, once they've done all these things and they've given everything they could, the next step is they have to give their own blood. And then once you give your own blood, then what are you doing? I mean, ultimately, you're having kids being sacrificed to these strange gods, and these nasty blood gods, you can hear about a lot of that when you look into the South American, Central American type religions like the Aztecs, the Incas, some of these guys. They have temples where there's still, you could see where the blood had just run down constantly because so many sacrifices. And the question you got to ask is, when have you sacrificed enough? Now, Abraham, he was from a household that his father actually made idols. That's one of the stories that you read in the Mishnah about this kind of little backstory, that when God had called him to leave his house and go to this new land, he was calling him away from a life that had something to do with idol worship. And it was a common practice in that time. They worshipped idols. They worshipped all these other gods. And the real God was saying, hey, stop worshiping these guys, you follow me, and I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to give you a child. Now, this was the promise that God had given him. Now, one of the things that you see in the story, Abraham, after Isaac's born, you see this part where God says, okay, take your son, your only son, and bring him up to this certain place and sacrifice him. Now, there's a few things going on, and I'm going to have to back up to explain these things. First of all, there's this idea that's called covenant. It's something that was a normal practice in the ancient days because they didn't have lawyers and other things like we have today. The only guarantee they had was blood. And so you would cut a covenant with your own blood, swearing upon something to basically say, if I don't do these things, then let this be done unto me. And well, Abraham was familiar with these type of covenants, and God wanted to get his attention and make sure he understood that he was going to give him a son. So he said, let's cut a covenant. So you hear the story, it's in Genesis 15, where all these different animals are laid out, and there's the blood's running, and you have Abraham walking through, and God walking through it, and then the oath, they swear this oath that, this is what I'm going to do. Abraham's side, it was to circumcise your children and make sure that they learn about God. God's part was to give him a child and make him, basically that child become a nation, a whole gigantic, something that just is beyond anything you can imagine. And I always use I like the time where God tells him to go outside of his tent and look up into the sky and try to count the stars. It's like, that's how your descendants are going to be. So this was the promise that God made. And now, one of the things I've always thought was weird is, why circumcision? That's odd. Well, if you watched any of the other videos in Genesis chapter 3, when humans had fallen and the curse was talked about, and in the curse there was a part where it said that the serpent who was part of this whole thing, or the devil, that there would come a seed from Eve, the seed of a woman, and it would crush the head of the serpent. So the seed, the promise of freedom from death and all of this whole cycle of just working hard and not even being able to get enough. And this whole cycle, it said that the freedom from it is going to come from this seed. Now, the seed was promised through Eve. The devil constantly tried to destroy the seed. But then you've got this with Abraham, where God is pulling aside somebody and creating a nation that does not exist at this point. And it's through his seed. Now, the promise through the seed, so that's why the covenant was cut, where obviously, you don't have to get much into that here, but you get the point of what I'm saying. So you see the story, and you see God's part, and there's this covenant, there's this promise. Now, one of the good examples of covenant that I've read is the story, I don't know if you've ever heard it before, but it's an old story from Dr. David Livingstone in Africa. There was Sir Henry Morton Stanley. So Stanley was looking for Livingstone. He was lost in Africa. And in the process, he come across this tribe that he couldn't get past. The chief, nobody would let him go through. And so some of the people that were with him said, hey, the only way you're going to get through this is if you cut a covenant with this chief. And so they go through the covenant process. And part of it is that the person you make a covenant with can ask of something from you. So something from whatever you have, and you get something in return. Well, this chief asked for this goat that Stanley had, and he needed this goat because he had all these stomach problems and things like that, and the goat, helped him feel better. And when his stomach was burning, he drank some goat's milk, and he was fine. But this chief was asking for this goat, and in return, the chief was going to give him this big piece of wood with a bunch of copper rubbed around it. It just looked like something you would buy at a flea market, discount canes of some sort. Well, come to find out, he ends up going along with it. He gives him the goat, and he takes the staff. And as he's going, he comes across another tribe. When they see the staff, they bow down before him. And they tell him, they realize that you are holding the sign of a king. You've made a covenant with this amazing, powerful warrior. So whatever you need, we're going to give you. So ultimately, that covenant, giving up that goat, was nothing compared to what he received in return. Being able to get the supplies and get the things that he needed and get through it to be able to find them. Now, that's a good example of covenant. So part of this, there's an asking of, there's a requirement of, God required that Abraham give his son. Now, follow this for a second, because in the story it says, your only son. That wasn't true, because Abraham had another son before that, Ishmael. So Ishmael was his first son, and Isaac was the promised child, the second son. So when God uses the term only son, it must mean something else. It must mean something bigger. And I always think of later on in the New Testament, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son. Now, was Jesus his only son? No, obviously not. There's all of us here, and there's other people. But it was unique. It was special. It's the uniqueness that matters, because there's something different about it. Now, in Hebrews, it says that when Abraham was going through this whole process, he believed that he would receive his son back from the dead. So there you go. You have somebody giving up their son, believing that that son would return from the dead so that we could be free. We could be free from sin and death, because Jesus was that promised son. Isaac was the most important person in the Old Testament for this one very important reason. It took Isaac, and it took Abraham being faithful to what God had told him and trusting God, knowing that God would never ask him to do something that would rid him of the thing that he had, believed him for from the beginning. He said, at worst case scenario, Isaac will be returned from the dead. And he said from the very beginning, when he went up to the mountain and he had his other servants with him, he said to the servants, we're going to go up and worship God, and we will return. There was no doubt in his mind that he was coming back. Now, last thing I want to point out, because I don't want to get too deep in this, because I want you to read the book. I want you to get a hold of the book, Adam is God, Eve is us, and read it for yourself. But one last thing I do want to point out. So, when they were on top of the mountain, and God says, no, Abraham, don't do this. Put the knife down. And he looks to the side and he sees there's a ram stuck in the sticks. And he calls God, the word is God, my provider. Yahweh, the provider. God provided his own sacrifice. Listen to what I'm saying here today. God provided his own sacrifice to save us. God provided his own sacrifice to take care of us. God did not require from us our own blood, something from it, because it's not enough. It's never enough. because there had been the one sacrifice once and for all, and that was the Son of God, the only Son, the unique Son, just like Abraham and Isaac, God and Jesus. You see the parallel, you see it tying together. Abraham, because he was willing to give his son, God had to, because of the covenant, had to give up his son. And because Abraham believed his son would return from the dead, God had to believe that Jesus would come back from the dead. All right, hope you get a hold of my book, read it, tune in again. I'll have some, I think I only have a couple more chapters to go, but we'll talk about that. And also, I'll talk a little bit more about my new book that's coming out called Napalm Puppies. I hope you definitely, when that comes out, I think it'll be very interesting. A lot longer than this book, a lot more involved. But yeah, thanks for listening to me today. That was another chapter out of Adam is God, Eve is Us.